He had buried two things in the same year: his wife and the version of himself that knew how to need someone. The grave for Carol was in Fredericton, New Brunswick, under a maple that went orange in October and looked, from a certain angle, like something on fire. He had stood beside it in his dress uniform the day they lowered her down, and the buttons on his jacket had caught the light, and he had thought, absurdly, that he should have worn something darker, something that matched what was happening inside him. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Malcolm Greer had moved north. Not dramatically north, not the kind of north that people romanticize over whiskey. No sled dogs, no aurora, no cinematic isolation. Just a 4-hour drive past Moncton on roads that narrowed until the trees closed in on both sides and the radio signal went to static. He had found the property through a listing he barely remembered reading. 2 acres. A wood frame house with a steep roof built for snow load. A creek that froze by November and thawed sometime in April, give or take. He had paid cash and moved in with a truck bed of things Carol would have called practical, and nothing she would have called comfortable. He had been a Navy SEAL for 22 years. He had learned to sleep with one eye on the door. He had learned to read a room before he entered it, to clock the exits, to measure the threat in a man's posture before the man opened his mouth. What he had never learned, what no amount of training had touched, was how to come home to a house where someone wasn't waiting. So he had stopped coming home to that kind of house altogether. The property had 2 outbuildings and a woodshed and a well that ran clean. There was a neighbor 3 kilometers down the road, a retired schoolteacher named Gus, who brought over a jar of spruce tip jam his first week and then left Malcolm alone after that, which was exactly what Malcolm wanted. The nearest town was Hartley Creek. Population, depending on the season, somewhere between 400 and 412. There was a hardware store, a gas station, a Legion Hall that smelled like the 80s, and a diner called Patrice's where the coffee came in mugs, the size of soup bowls, and nobody asked you twice how you were doing. Malcolm liked Hartley Creek for exactly that reason. He built a routine the way he had once built forward operating bases, with precision, without sentiment, and with a clear understanding of what he needed to survive. He woke before dawn. He ran 6 kilometers on the logging road regardless of the weather, which in February meant running through darkness so absolute he could hear his own heartbeat. He came back. He made coffee. He split wood until his shoulders burned. He ate simply, slept adequately, and asked nothing of the days except that they pass. People in Hartley Creek thought he was unfriendly. He was not unfriendly. He was just finished. The thing about grief, the thing they never put in the pamphlets the base chaplain used to hand out, is that it does not always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like efficiency. Sometimes it looks like a man who answers direct questions with direct answers and volunteers nothing, and declines every invitation so smoothly that people eventually stop extending them. Malcolm had declined the Legion Christmas dinner. He had declined the ice fishing weekend Gus mentioned in January. He had declined the invitation from the woman at the hardware store, who organized a community potluck every February to break the cabin fever. He had done it politely each time, because Carol had raised him to be polite. No, that was wrong. Carol had not raised him. Carol had loved him, and being loved by someone like Carol had eventually worn down the sharpest edges. But Carol was gone now, and the edges were coming back. He did not want them to come back. He simply did not know how to stop them. It was the 2nd week of March when the dog appeared. Malcolm was coming back from his morning run, steam rising off his jacket, breath clouding in the cold, when he saw her at the tree line. A shepherd mix of some kind, he could not tell in the low light, lying with her chin on her front paws and her eyes tracking him with the focused, assessing attention he recognized from working dogs in the field. She was thin. Not the thin of a dog that had missed a few meals, but the thin of a dog that had been managing on her own for weeks, maybe longer, burning through whatever reserve she had left. She did not come to him. She did not run. She just watched. Malcolm kept walking. He went inside. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and looked at the spot where she had been, and she was still there. He told himself she would move on. Dogs moved on. They followed scent trails and found farms and people who wanted them. She was not his problem. He ate breakfast. He went out to split wood, When he came around the side of the house, she had moved from the tree line to the edge of his yard, and she was lying in the same position, chin on paws, eyes on him, as though she had simply relocated the observation post. "I don't have dog food," he said. She did not move. He went back inside and fried an extra egg and brought it out on a piece of toast and set it on the ground at a respectful distance. She waited until he had taken 3 steps back before she rose, slowly, favoring her left rear leg, and crossed to it and ate. She was nursing. He could see that clearly once she stood. She had been nursing recently, or was still nursing, which meant there were puppies somewhere. Malcolm stood in the cold with his arms at his sides and thought about that. He found them 40 minutes later, following her when she led him. And she did lead him. There was no other word for it. She kept pausing and looking back until he followed. Through a section of bush behind the woodshed to a collapsed section of old fencing where someone, years ago, had stacked lumber that had since rotted into a low shelter. Underneath it, in a hollow lined with leaves, and what looked like shredded insulation from somewhere, were 3 puppies. They were maybe 4 weeks old. Maybe 5, small enough that they fit in his hands, 2 to a hand, though there were only 3. One the color of dark caramel, one black as a new tire, one the particular pale gold that reminded him of birchwood in winter light. They were alive. They were cold. They were making sounds so small he had to hold very still to hear them. The mother lay down beside them. She looked at him. Malcolm Greer, who had not asked for this, who had specifically structured his life to contain exactly none of this, crouched down in the snow behind his woodshed and understood, with the clarity that occasionally visited him at inconvenient moments, that he was not going to walk away. He brought them inside. He put the mother and puppies in a cardboard box, lined with 2 of his oldest flannel shirts, and set the box near the baseboard heater in the mudroom. He drove into Hartley Creek and stood in the pet food aisle for 11 minutes. He was aware of the time, because he kept checking his watch the way he did when he was somewhere he didn't want to be. Before a teenage kid's stocking shelves, asked if he needed help, and he said he had a nursing dog and 3 puppies, approximately 4 to 5 weeks old, and the kid looked at him with an expression of sudden respect and helped him load the cart. He bought puppy formula and a small syringe, in case the mother's milk was insufficient. He bought high-protein food for the mother. He bought a thermometer to monitor temperature. He drove home in the particular way he drove when he was executing a task that had clear parameters and required focus. Both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, thinking about what came next and not about why he was doing it. He did not think about why he was doing it. At least, he tried not to. The mother he called Cedar. Not because it was a sentimental name, but because there was a big cedar at the corner of the property that had survived 3 windstorms he knew of, and that seemed like a relevant quality. For 4 days, Cedar and the puppies stayed in the mudroom, and Malcolm stayed out of the mudroom as much as possible. On the 5th day, he sat on the floor in there for an hour and read a manual about wilderness drainage he had been meaning to get through since November. Cedar watched him from the box. The puppies slept in a heap the way small things sleep, without strategy, without vigilance, completely committed to unconsciousness in a way he had not been capable of for years. On the 6th day, one of the puppies climbed out of the box. It was the black one, the smallest, but apparently unaware of this, possessed of the kind of confidence that suggested it had never once considered whether its ambitions were proportional to its abilities. It climbed over the side of the box, fell approximately 10 centimeters onto the floor, sat up, shook itself, and then walked, staggering, tilting, correcting, in the direction of Malcolm's boot. Malcolm watched it arrive at his boot. It sat down against the toe cap and looked up at him. Malcolm looked back. "That was a bad idea," he said. The puppy put its chin on his boot. He named that one Sergeant, because it had that quality, the quality of an NCO who has decided something is going to happen and has communicated this decision to you without asking your opinion. The caramel-colored one he named Gully, because it moved exactly the way water moved through a gully, finding the path of least resistance, flowing around obstacles, absolutely unstoppable without being aggressive about it. Gully was the one who discovered, on day 8, that the space between the washer and the dryer was accessible from a certain angle. and who had to be retrieved from it twice before Malcolm improvised a barrier from a piece of plywood he found in the shed. The pale gold one he called Birk. No particular reason. The name just arrived one morning when he was watching her sleep. She was the quietest of the three. She did not climb out of boxes or wedge herself into appliances. She waited. She observed with an attentiveness that reminded him, uncomfortably, of his own best field instinct. The capacity to go very still and read what was actually happening, rather than what was supposed to be happening. He noticed that when he had the nightmares, and he had them 2 or 3 nights a week, the particular kind that involved noise and light, and the wrong name being called in the dark, Birk was always the first one who was awake when he came out of it. Not distressed, not barking, just sitting up in the box with her eyes on the doorway where he appeared, as though she had been expecting him. This was not something he mentioned to anyone, because he did not mention things to anyone. Cedar was recovering. She was eating well, her ribs were becoming less visible, her leg had turned out to be strained rather than broken. It bore weight, and by the end of the 2nd week, she was moving normally. She remained watchful of Malcolm in the particular way working dogs watched people they respected but did not yet fully trust. Always aware of him, always noting his position, not exactly relaxed, but no longer prepared to bolt. He understood that completely. The 3rd week was the difficult one, not because of the dogs. The dogs were actually, he noticed, the most manageable part of his days now. They had requirements, feeding times, warmth, the socialization that puppies needed at this stage, and requirements had always been easier for him than options. Options were where he got lost. Options were where the silence grew too large. The difficult week was difficult because it was March 19th, the day Carol had said yes, not to the proposal, that had been in a coffee shop in Fredericton on an unremarkable Tuesday, and she had said yes while eating a lemon tart, and he had put the ring on her finger and she had said, "You did that backwards. You're supposed to give the ring first and I say yes." And he had said, "I was worried about the order of operations." She had laughed. She had a way of laughing that suggested she found the world genuinely, consistently funny, which was either the best or the most impractical quality in a person. And he had never fully decided which. March 19th was the day she had said yes to trying again after the 2nd miscarriage. They had been sitting in their kitchen in Shearwater, and it was snowing, and she had been very quiet for a long time, and then she had said, "I think we should try again." And he had said, "Are you sure?" And she had said, "I'm not, but I think we should try anyway." That was Carol. "I'm not sure, but let's try anyway." He had tried to hold himself together on March 19th, the way he held himself together on the anniversaries, with routine and physical exhaustion, and the conscious application of forward motion. He ran 10 kilometers instead of 6. He split wood until he couldn't lift the axe. He made dinner. He sat down at the table, and the dogs were in the mudroom, and the house was entirely quiet, and something in him simply cracked. Not dramatically, no sound, more like the way ice sometimes shifts in a river at the end of winter. Barely perceptible on the surface, but underneath, something giving way that had been under enormous pressure for a very long time. Sargent found him. Malcolm did not know how Sargent got out of the mudroom, because he was certain he had latched the door. He had not latched the door. He knew this because Sargent was suddenly standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at him with the expression of a creature who has located a problem and is consulting its available resources. Available resources in this case were limited. Sargent was 9 weeks old and weighed approximately 2 kilograms. He walked across the kitchen floor, which was cold linoleum, which had never bothered him in any of his visits to that floor before, and he put his chin on Malcolm's knee. Malcolm put his hand on the back of the puppy's neck. He sat there for a while. By the time Gully appeared in the doorway, also unclear how, also probably shouldn't have been able to get the latch. And Birk behind him, Malcolm was still sitting on the floor, but he was breathing normally, and the crack had sealed over enough that he thought he could probably stand up and make tea. He made tea. He went and opened the mudroom door properly, so Cedar could come out too, because it seemed like the right thing to do. She came out, assessed the situation with the calm practicality of a dog who had pulled her puppies through February in a collapsed lumber pile, and lay down in the middle of the kitchen floor as though she had always lived there. He drank his tea. The dogs fell asleep in a pile near the heat register. He watched them sleep and thought about Carol, saying, "I'm not sure, but let's try anyway." Spring came to Hartley Creek the way it always came to that part of New Brunswick. Not all at once, but in permissions. The creek thawed by degrees. The logging road softened. The maples got a reddish tinge before anything resembling a leaf appeared, a signal only noticeable if you were paying attention, and Malcolm was paying attention now in ways he hadn't been since the fall. Cedar began coming on his morning runs in late April. She did not need to be invited. She simply materialized beside him when he opened the door, matched his pace with an ease that suggested she had been running this road in her mind all winter, and stayed at his left shoulder. He was aware, on these runs, of running differently. Not faster, not slower, just differently, like a man running with someone rather than a man running away. Sargent had grown into exactly the dog his name predicted. Opinionated, affectionate in the way of people who are certain their affection is warranted, and possessed of an absolute conviction that whatever Malcolm was doing could be improved by his involvement. If Malcolm was reading, Sargent sat on the book. If Malcolm was on the phone with his sister in Ottawa, the first time he'd called her since Christmas, she'd cried a little, he'd let her. Sargent sat on his feet. If Malcolm was working on the drainage ditch along the north side of the property, a project he'd been putting off for 2 years, Sargent sat in the freshly dug trench and observed. Gully, true to form, found every possible gap in every possible fence and had to be retrieved from the neighbor's yard, from the creek bank, from behind the Legion Hall in Hartley Creek. How, Malcolm could not reconstruct. On a Tuesday afternoon when he had brought all 3 dogs into town for their first set of vaccinations. The vet, a woman named Dr. Tran who ran the clinic out of a converted farmhouse at the edge of town, had watched Malcolm manage Gully's escape attempt with the focused, minimal movement of someone who had done much harder things, and had said, "You've got that dog well handled." He had said, "I've met one other creature in my life with that much independent initiative, and she was a lieutenant colonel." Dr. Tran had laughed. He had felt, for a brief, confused moment, that this was significant, and then he had paid the vet bill and taken the dogs home. Birk was the one who found the Hendersons' boy. His name was Owen, which felt immediately uncomfortable to Malcolm, given his own careful avoidance of the name. The way it belonged to someone else now, some older grief. But he was 8 years old, and he had wandered from his parents' campsite at the provincial park, 3 kilometers from Malcolm's property on a long weekend in May. The park staff had organized a search. Malcolm had heard the vehicles on the road and walked out to the highway and asked what was happening. And when they told him, he had simply turned around, walked back to his property, put on the dogs' leads. All 4 of them, Cedar and the 3 who were now nearly 6 months old, and walked into the bush. He had done search and rescue training in his 3rd year of service, a long time ago, and he had never lost the way it felt to move through wilderness looking for a signal. Not the training, specifically. The way of paying attention. Birk pulled the lead out of his hand 30 minutes in and disappeared into a stand of young fir. He followed. Birk had found a small stream and, following the stream, had found a wet and frightened 8-year-old sitting on a rock talking quietly to himself. Owen Henderson looked up at Malcolm and then at Birk and said, "That dog found me." Malcolm crouched down. "She did. I told myself not to move," Owen said. "My dad says if you're lost, you stay put." "Your dad's right," Malcolm said. "You did exactly right." He walked Owen out. Cedar and Sargent and Gully were waiting at the tree line where he'd last seen them, which said something about Cedar's field sense that Malcolm appreciated without being surprised by. He handed Owen over to the park staff, and 2 very pale and shaking parents, and a news photographer appeared from somewhere and wanted to take his picture, and he said no, and got in the truck and drove home. That evening, Gus came down the road with a bottle of scotch that was better than anything Malcolm had bought for himself since Carol died, and he sat on the porch steps, and they drank it slowly and watched the tree line go dark. "Heard what you did today," Gus said. "The dog did it," Malcolm said. Gus considered this. "That what they're saying?" "That's what happened." Gus poured them each another measure. "You seem different than when you arrived." Malcolm thought about this for a moment. He thought about March 19th and the kitchen floor and Sargent's chin on his knee. He thought about Cedar running at his shoulder on the logging road in the dark mornings. He thought about Birk sitting up in the box every time the nightmares came. "I had some help," he said. Gus nodded. He did not ask what kind. That was what Malcolm had always appreciated about Gus. He understood that some things did not require elaboration, only acknowledgement. The nightmares did not stop that summer. He did not expect them to stop, but they came less frequently, and when he woke from them now, there was always a warm weight somewhere. Against his feet, or along his side, or occasionally, if Sargent had been particularly determined, on the pillow beside his head. And the weight was its own kind of answer to the darkness. Not a solution, an accompaniment. He called his sister more often. He began going to Patrice's diner on Saturday mornings instead of making coffee alone, because Sargent made it impossible to be alone. The dog's need to assess every new situation was not negotiable. And after 3 Saturdays, the woman at the table by the window, who turned out to be the school librarian, started bringing her own dog on the 4th Saturday, and by June there were 4 of them at the same table every week, none of whom had planned this. All of whom had somehow decided, without discussing it, that Saturday mornings at Patrice's were where they were now. He thought about Carol's voice, the particular way she said his name the mornings he woke early, not alarmed, just aware. Moll, like a hand on a shoulder, just checking. He did not stop missing her. He was not, he had decided, supposed to stop missing her. Missing her was part of what remained of a life they had been building together, and he was not willing to give that up in exchange for not hurting. But he had learned, slowly, over a long winter and a spring that arrived permission by permission, that carrying something heavy was different from being crushed by it, that there was a distance between grief and absence, that a man could be broken in certain ways and still be useful, still be present, still be someone a frightened child could look at through a stand of fir trees and feel like he was going to be okay. Cedar lay under the kitchen table most evenings now, which Malcolm allowed without having made a conscious decision to allow it. Birk had claimed the wool blanket on the old armchair by the window. Gully slept wherever logic failed to predict, which was, on reflection, the most honest possible way to exist. Sargent slept against Malcolm's left side, which Malcolm had tried to discourage for approximately 1 week, before recognizing that some things were not going to be discouraged. One evening in late August, with the light going amber through the kitchen window and the creak audible through the screen door, and all 4 dogs arranged around him in their various unstrategic ways, Malcolm wrote an email to his sister. A long one, the kind he had not written in 3 years. He told her about Hartley Creek and the diner and the school librarian and Owen Henderson. He told her that the puppies were not really puppies anymore. He told her carefully that he was still sad, but that sad and unreachable were not the same thing, and that he had spent long enough confusing them. He did not send it that night. He read it over in the morning, changed 2 sentences, and sent it then. His sister wrote back within the hour. She said, "I've been waiting." He read that. And outside the window, the maple at the corner of the property was already beginning to turn, and Cedar was lying in a patch of September sun on the porch boards, and Sargent was somewhere doing something that would require explanation shortly, and Malcolm Greer, who had come north to become nothing, understood that he had become something else instead. Not the same something he had been before. He was not trying to be that. He was trying to be what was possible now in this house, with this particular grief, and these 4 dogs and these mornings on the logging road, and these Saturdays at Patrice's and this amber light coming through the window. It turned out that was enough. It turned out. And he had not expected this, not remotely, not even in the most careful calculations he had made in the night, that enough was the beginning of something.